Hello, and thank you for joining us today. This is Kevin Benedict, SAP Mentor and EDI and e-Invoicing veteran. And I have with me today as guest Jason Jones, the Vice President of Professional Services from Crossgate. Thank you for joining us today, Jason.
Thanks for having me.
Now, what I would like to talk to you about is all this exciting e-invoicing, all these exciting e-invoicing developments in Argentina today. Can you share with us what are some of the most recent developments and perhaps deadlines that are motivating people to ask all these questions about e-invoicing in Argentina?
Sure. I guess the first thing probably would be just helpful just to kind of give people an overview, especially for people outside of Argentina. A lot of multinationals in particular are struggling with these requirements because it's unusual. And as part of the e-invoicing process, it's being mandated by the government itself. Before each and every invoice is delivered to a customer, it has to be approved by the government. It has to be registered with the government in advance, much like you might get a credit card transaction approved at the cash register. And so that means this process becomes very mission critical because if you can't get your invoices out and you can't recognize your revenue and you can't collect your cash, and so you want to make sure that you're in compliance with the government, but you also want to make sure that you don't affect your daily business operations as well. And so recently in Argentina, the government has been slowly ramping up their mandates, their mandate to adopt electronic invoicing processes. And the way they do it is their tax authority, which is called the AFIP, they maintain a series of web services. And the task is to integrate with those web services depending upon the different type of invoice that you may be creating. And then you'll get an approval number back. They call it a CAI number, a CAE number. And that CAI number must actually be printed on your invoice, and then there's another number they call it an ODN, an official document number. That number also must go back into your ERP system and must be stored as part of the invoice for reporting to the government later. So there's a fair amount of complexity in adjusting your business processes to accommodate these requirements, and also to stay on top of these rules as they change over time.
So, Jason, who is required to support this requirement?
Well, pretty much all the companies in Argentina. Last year, for example, it was mostly it's evolving. Last year, it was focused mostly on exporters, whereas this year that mandate has progressed to include domestic invoice activity as well. The specific type of regulations vary by industry, so different types of web services actually might be required for different industry, like for insurance or fuel. They have different web services than for others, and typically the government is notifying the companies that have not yet complied. So there's more of there's a broader timeline for the market in general, but then there's also some specific notifications that are going out on top of that as well.
So does this prevent people from doing any business until they get those numbers back from the government?
Well, in Argentina is actually a little bit more relaxed than some other countries in Latin America. So, for example, in Latin America, for example, in Brazil, you wouldn't even be able to ship unless you get your invoice registered with the government. So that actually can affect the logistics and the business of documents going out the door. In Mexico, it depends upon your business process. It could inhibit you from shipping depending upon the kind of documentation you ship with. Argentina, you can't. Let's put it this way: you can't ship your invoice. You can still ship your goods, but you can't ship your invoice. You can't make a request for payment, and therefore you can't record the revenue on your books until you've got the invoice registered with the government. So it is a real-time e-invoicing process. It's not like you just tell them later at the end of the month. You have to tell them in real time. And if you happen to ship with an invoice, as you would always do for exports, then then you would need to have that approved before you ship. For domestic transactions, it's possible to ship with a non-invoice document like a bill of lading or a mission, as they call it. For export transactions, you need your invoice, so you got to have that registered before you ship. But in all cases, before you make a request for payment, before you send an invoice, you're going to have to do this as part of your normal business process.
Wow. So are there specific dates or deadlines that people doing business in Argentina should be aware of?
They not specifically. I mean, because they should stay. Let's put it this way. That's what I'm saying. It's not like, for example, in Brazil where they say, this year they said March 31st, boom, everyone has to be compliant with NotiFiscal 2.0. And in Mexico they said, December 31st, boom, everyone must be compliant with CFTI. Argentina is they do have some dates that they publish, but they also follow up individually with companies, by industry or even individually. So for the most part, what we've seen is companies know when they have to comply, and typically it's by the end of the year, or there may be some. So it's difficult to pinpoint exactly. It may be by the end of the year, or it may be by other dates that are more aggressive than that or more lenient than that, depending upon depending upon their industry or individualized treatment by the government itself.
So if I receive notification that I need to be supporting these requirements in Argentina, what are my options? Do I train my staff? Do I send them to some seminar or webinar, or do I bring in third parties? Do I find outsourced managed services that would do this for me? What are the options companies have?
There's really two options. I mean, it's the sort of build versus buy, kind of thing. Some companies are trying to, hook this all up themselves and put it inside their system infrastructure. And so that's an integration project. You have to figure out, okay, how am I going to get this information from my back-end ERP system? How am I going to convey that information out to whatever middleware solution I might be using? How am I going to connect to the different web services that are involved? And how am I going to, take that, this what I call the signing attributes, how am I going to take that signing information and print it out on the invoice, and then ultimately update my ERP system on the back end? It's certainly possible to do that, but it's complicated and tricky. And of course, these rules are frequently changing, so it's the kind of thing that you have to stay on top of, and especially if you operate in markets, throughout the world or throughout Latin America, then this can become an ongoing challenge. And for that reason, that's why we're a player in the space. Crossgate, we provide managed services e-invoicing solutions. We have a global e-invoicing network, so customers and companies can focus on their ERP system. They can focus on their the configuration of their back-end ERP system, their fiscal data. They can convey that fiscal data out to our managed service network, and we'll add the compliance layer on top of that. So that means we'll convert that message into the format that's required by the government. And as I mentioned, there's different web services that are required throughout Argentina for exports versus domestics versus business to consumer transactions, and even further by industry. And then there are some complexities in these web services. So for example, Argentina in particular, their web services, they impose a sequencing requirement, which means that this official document number, it has to be issued in sequence. It has to go from like 1, 2, 3, and then 4. You can't skip. But at the same time, imagine you have high volume and you're doing 100 invoices a day or whatever the case may be. You don't want a problem on invoice number 3 to prevent the rest of your invoices from getting registered and approved. And because these official document numbers are maintained by your back-end ERP system, but validated by the government web services, the government doesn't provide you the number. You provide the number. They just check and make sure it's in sequence. So if you got a problem on invoice number 3, that could hold up your whole processing if you don't structure your integration to be resilient to that. So what you need to do is you need to say, okay, I think this is going to be official document number 3. Then you run it through the process, and if it gets approved, well, then it is official document number 3. But if there's a glitch and it gets rejected because maybe some of your codes aren't valid or whatever, then okay, that one's stuck, and then the other ones go through, and the next one that goes through becomes invoice number 3, and then whenever the one that was rejected originally is corrected, well, then it becomes invoice number 4 or whatever. This is the kind of thing you need to be aware of when you're structuring your integration. It's the kind of thing that we take care of in our own solutions, to insulate you from that. That's why a lot of companies, particularly global companies, kind of have their cake and eat it too. They install some tracking capabilities within their ERP system. So from the standpoint of a user that's running the invoicing process, they still invoice the way they did every day. They hit the button, the invoice gets generated, it goes out through the network, it gets approved, it gets printed, they walk over to their printer, they pick it up, and then of course their ERP system is updated with the ODN number. Naturally, we believe there's a lot of value in doing things that way because companies can just focus on configuring their back-end ERP system. They don't have to train their people on a whole new, complicated process. They just watch the traffic light go from yellow to green, and they walk over to their printer and they get their invoices, and then they can kind of outsource, if you will, the whole compliance aspect of dealing with these web services and these sequencing and staying on top of these rules as they change over time.